It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 540, April the 11th, 1982. Before we get started on the news of the week, I have two apologies. One for the throat last week. I couldn't help it. It was pretty bad. The condition's over now. I had a cold, and you were patient with me. It's pretty bad on the tapes, too, I'm sure, if you play it back. Also, the second half of the broadcast that I did on the murder of John Belushi, that's tape number 537. Those of you who subscribe to the tapes, it did not record well. So if you haven't returned it, mail it back to me, and I'll be doing another half hour on the murder of John Belushi and get that out to you in the mail this week. For those who get it on the broadcast, it comes over fine, but the tape cassette, we had trouble making that tape cassette. Now I will get right into the matter of the Falkland Islands, because that's what I expect most of you want me to talk about this evening, and to give an educated guess on what I think is happening down there. Just one moment before I get into that, I want to mention the Israelis at the border of Lebanon. We hear the stories, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but if an Israeli diplomat is killed in Paris and two Israelis are murdered on the border of the Israeli-occupied territory, I don't think that justifies 40,000 Israeli troops arming along the border of Lebanon. We hear the stories, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but if an Israeli diplomat is killed in Paris and two Israelis are murdered on the border of the Israeli-occupied territory, I don't think that justifies 40,000 Israeli troops arming along the border of Lebanon. A lot of people think sometimes I'm too patient with Israel, but those that have listened for a long time know that I am very disgusted with that country, and I have no patience at all. I can't see putting 40,000 people on the border of a country to wage war because 3 members of their country were murdered. It's just outright ridiculous. And furthermore, the invasion plans to go into Lebanon have to be agreed upon by the United States, the Defense Department, Secretary of Defense, and so forth. Remember, several weeks ago on this program, I read a memo that under the table they would give Israel the green light, such as they did to bomb the atomic plant in Iraq. There's no way that a small country like that would take on Lebanon and the Middle East at this time unless this was simultaneous with things that are going on at other parts of the world. I'm not sure what they are or why they're doing this. My worst fear is that at this time, while Great Britain is fighting Argentina down in the Falkland Islands and Israel is going into Lebanon, that maybe South Africa may decide to walk right into Angola, and we'd have a border of countries moving into territory they've wanted to do for a long time, leaving the United States totally defenseless to interrupt any of the Anschluss, similar to the way that Hitler took countries during World War II when that war broke out. Now, the pictures in the newspaper of the Falkland Island episode, the coverage of Alexander Haig is outrageous. In one photograph, he's here holding hands with Margaret Thatcher, and he's smiling from ear to ear. I've referred to Reichstag Haig, the warmonger Haig, the Nazi Haig, the man who'd get us in World War III Haig, and this guy really is happy now. I mean, he looks like he's going to a wedding. He's never been happier. He wants to be commander-in-chief and lead us into this holy war that he's been building up ever since he got out of West Point and joined General Douglas MacArthur down in Korea. He married the daughter of the head of the military who was stationed at Taiwan. And I've done a biography of Haig from time to time in his position. And whenever he's on a peace mission, you can be sure that what is left behind is a bloodbath. Another picture of Secretary Haig discussing the Argentine problem with the president of Argentina. He flies down there, ear-to-ear smile. They're just as jovial, the two of them. It's a big joke on us, and they are smiling. He is smiling, and there's no serious business about the consequences of the kinds of actions that might take place. Another article, Haig's mission, peace in the Falklands. Well, he had a finger in the South Korean War. He didn't leave peace there. As an article in the New York Times this week that the South Koreans hate the United States. There's anti-United States feeling identical to Iran. We left the masses in a form of slavery. The president of South Korea, was shot, and the new president who took over was at the same dinner party assisting in his murder. We left a military dictatorship in Korea. He then went on to Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos with the acid rains, the napalm, the mutilations, the Phoenix program, the displacement of villages and lives destroyed, the beginning of mass importation of drugs, narcotics, opening up into the United States. The CIA heroin connections began to pour in after we opened the Southeast Asian War. Haig was a big part of that, too, with Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, with that going on. And then, of course, Haig and the Rockefeller clan that chased Manhattan, and Henry Kissinger and his Fritz Kramer crowd over in Iran with the Shah of Iran and the notorious Savak. And what happened when that country got so bad that nobody could stand them, the middle class, not the communists or the poor. They turned that entire country over to Khomeini and the Muslims, and it began a strong bond of Muslims in the Middle East. The blundering of what we did in the Middle East accomplished what the Grand Mufti and Hitler would always want, turning these countries over to the Muslims. And Haig had a finger, of course, in bungling the whole thing, including the hostages and bringing the Shah to this country. And then as soon as Ronald Reagan was president, he wanted to encircle Cuba and have Cuba be attacked by the United States. He had his finger in Central America, in the bloodbaths of El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. And now he's down in South America, the hotbed and home of the Nazis, of his mentor, and Kissinger's mentor, Fritz Kramer, of the Pentagon. And I've done broadcasts, and we'll do more on them. Alexander Haig has a path that doesn't lead to peace. So when you see him smiling in England and you see him smiling in Argentina, what he's smiling about is the power that he has. It has nothing to do with you or me or our safety. Friend or person that I met just yesterday was at my home. He was in Washington testifying last week on the Abscam matter, and I'll go into more of that next week. He said that Pentagon is geared for war, and they say 1/3 of the American citizens will survive. They accept that figure that 1/3 will survive. Anybody who's been to Washington recently, and I've heard this from two other people, it is a warfare state taken over by Haig and the Pentagon, the National Security Council, defense intelligence agencies. They want a war, and we are going to be brought into it one way or the other. Ever since Haig has been with Ronald Reagan, he would have had a war against Libya. When those planes were shot down, when Sadat was killed, he would have us in war in the Sudan. And every week I run down the wars. They would have us go into Poland and fight Russia, or Central America. But now there's a situation that has been brewing for a long, long time, and I'm going into the history down there and the predictions of Admiral Byrd in 1946 and 1947 that World War III would start down in Antarctica by the Falkland Islands, with Argentina, Antarctica, and in that area. He knew and said in a press conference, two press conferences in Santiago, Chile in March of 1947, again in July 1947, that World War III would be set off down in that area. Well, when Admiral Byrd got home, he was met by James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense, and I'll do more of that later in the broadcast. 2 years later, Forrestal was murdered, thrown out of a window at Bethesda Hospital 2 months after he got a Distinguished Medal from Eisenhower. Forrestal was with Admiral Byrd on consultations. Byrd went down to see if Eisenhower and the Russians were correct that Adolf Hitler was down in Antarctica building secret weapons and so forth. All of the papers of Admiral Byrd are locked up, top secret to this day. They're not available of what he saw. And right after he was met by Forrestal, shortly after that, Forrestal was murdered. And I'll give you the references on some of the books on the death of Forrestal and the meeting with Admiral Byrd. Now, to understand where Alexander Haig is coming from, or our Pentagon, that breaks us apart and is bankrupting this country by demanding weapons, demanding things we can't afford or our allies can't afford. These people are destroying the United States, and they've been hell-bent on that since the end of World War II. They will break the British Empire financially and economically also. They will pit us against our allies, such as Britain and other allies to come. They will support, these people eventually will support a South American bloodbath. They put Salvador Allende out of office and put Pinochet in office. Our ambassador to the UN, Jeane Kirkpatrick, was very busy as soon as Reagan was in office, traveling to South Africa, Chile, and Argentina. And the things that the United States government wanted the most with William Buckley and the State Department was to build up and support Argentina, forget about the missing people, forget about the tortures, and they're still going on, and the murders are still going on in Chile and Argentina. These people were traveling back and forth to send money to them. In fact, we renewed our naval activities with Argentina recently. Now, the Falkland Island controversy has been going on against Britain for a long time. So instead of asking them to settle that before we shared Navy battles or simulated battles with Argentina, we did all that. The United States Navy, Jimmy Carter, when he was president, didn't want to deal with Chile or Argentina under these circumstances. And the first thing that happened when Ronald Reagan came in with Alexander Haig and Caspar Weinberger and the group from the Hoover Institute and the Pentagon establishment that was there before was to recognize and encourage these people. Now, Jeane Kirkpatrick was at the embassy, the Argentine, she was the guest of the Argentine officials the night that they took over the Falkland Islands from Great Britain. She was asked on national television about the controversy here, her opinion. She said, well, at the UN, we voted one way, but in the evening they socialized, and that it had nothing to do with the dinner party that was set weeks ahead. Well, you could always pick up a telephone and decline and really stay neutral, but she was dining with the Argentine people, identical to the night that two fellows were let out of prison who were part of the murder of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. on Embassy Row. And those fellows were released from prison, and the night they were out, William French Smith was having dinner with the Chilean embassy. These people are telling you through their actions what they think is happening, and you don't have to listen to their answers on these programs. Watch who they see and where they go, and it's very important to know where she was eating dinner the night that our ally, Great Britain, was kicked out of the islands. Now, I'm very harsh on Haig, I am, but I've studied this history, and in order to understand the Falkland Islands, again, and the Antarctica story, you have to go back to 1937 and 1939. That may be too far for some people to try and go back, but I'm going to read some pages from a book, and I have a lot of files and articles on Antarctica and on these bases, but one book in particular that I've mentioned before on these broadcasts, it's called UFO's Nazi Secret Weapon, published by Samizdat Publishers in Toronto, Canada. Now, many of the longtime researchers own this book, and they have a series of publications that come out of Canada. This is a pro-German Nazi publication out of Canada, and they have books and brochures and tape cassettes that come out all the time. But I want to directly read from this book because it's so pertinent, and those of you who have this book just have to bear with me because there's many who listen to the radio broadcast who don't have it, and if you're interested and want to send for it, I'll give you the address. Just pertaining to that area, on page 86 and 87, it talks about, first of all, the Guinness Book of Records at the end of World War II. The greatest unsolved robbery was at the end of the war when the Reichsbank treasury was emptied of all its money and the bank vaults in Berlin were completely emptied out, and the headquarters for the World Monetary Fund in Basel, Switzerland, found that they had $15 billion in circulation that shouldn't exist. There was forged money. The code name was Operation Bernhardt. There were expert forgers. And so that this is the kind of money that could finance the operations that they're describing in this book. The prelude to the operations was that the money was available and somebody was making the equipment for these people that this book is writing about and manufacturing secret weapons for the future. Now, this book claims that Hitler planned far ahead to have a colony down in Antarctica. And if you buy the maps put out by National Geographic, 1957, there's a map of Hitler staking in 1939, 1937, his territory in Antarctica. He sent polar expeditions out. This book says the secret Nazi expeditionary force was headed by Captain Reicher, R-I-T-S-C-H-E-R, and took place 1937 and 38, their first expeditions. They landed in the Queen Maud Land and established bases there. They took over 11,000 photographs for map purposes and had a swastika flag dropped every 20 kilometers to substantiate the German claim that they had this land in Antarctica. It was a terrain claimed by Germany itself for the first time, and they found warm lakes, an ice-free oasis, and an area, an unexplored area before that they gave German names, the mountains and the plateaus and so forth. It was free of ice, and there were warm lakes in this area, and other books that I have show the drawings. Now, added to the credence to these bases are the remarks of Mr. von Ribbentrop, this book says, at the outbreak of the war, World War II, in accordance with Germany's long-range political strategy, we have taken into firm possession the Antarctic area called the New Swabia, and it will be and ensure a safe retreat in case of necessity, Mr. Ribbentrop said at the beginning of World War II. And this book has maps of the Byrd expedition going down after the war. They said Antarctica would be an ideal place for bases. There was no rust, no germs, no illnesses or decomposition, no bacillus, no flies, no bugs, and not even a common cold would survive. It would be a perfect place to live. And they show the food and the trays for somebody like Adolf Hitler, who was a vegetarian. Now, this book shows in January 1947 pictures that Admiral Byrd took of headquarters at Antarctica. Now, this book asks the question, how could all this have taken place in the 20th century without detection? Hardly, they say. What steps were taken to discover the truth? Question mark. What has been done about the secret bases, about their existence? Why did the world not hear about these incredible events? Obviously, Hitler's escape was soon discovered by others. There were statements of Stalin and Eisenhower and quoted sources, and they speculate the Nuremberg trial was staged to show that they had surrounded and rounded up these particular Nazis. Washington, Moscow, and London decided that they had to go down to Antarctica to investigate what was happening, so they used the excuse of scientific work and set up a large expedition with 4,000 specially selected elite United States Navy troops with an 8-month food supply, 13 ships under the control of Admiral Byrd to make, in quotes, a scientific expedition composed of military types and no scientists. The U.S. Antarctic Battle Fleet left Norfolk, Virginia, December the 2nd, 1946, as battle groups, and England and Norway also sent forces down. Churchill, and this is a statement of Winston Churchill, and this comes in later to the UFOs and the bases and the confusion of UFOs that have continued since. Churchill at that time spoke of the Iron Curtain in 1946-47. He said, in quotes, the Crusaders in Europe, this is a quote, killed the wrong pig, end quote. Churchill realized they should have destroyed Bolshevik Russia and not Germany. The general public was told that this was a research mission to locate uranium and to study the weather. Admiral Byrd undertook this with the armed observation camps that were set up because the pole, the South Pole, lies between us and our enemies. And they considered in 1947 the enemies, Germany and the Nazis, that had gone down there during the war and after the war, and that they would be trouble later, and they wanted to find out. These were continuous enemies because they didn't believe the war was over, and they went down there. Further questioning as to who the enemy was asked July 7th in Santiago, Chile, of Admiral Byrd, in quotations from El Mercurio, a newspaper down there. And he said the Axis powers had been only defeated and had unconditionally surrendered, but he really realized that they would rise again, and he had an interview in the paper in San Diego, Chile. It was soon learned that the scientific job, the mission, the task of observing the activities of the foreign power, Nazi Germany, in the South Pole region was part of the activity that Admiral Byrd reported back. He wanted, in quotes, to break the last desperate resistance of Adolf Hitler. In case we find him inside his new Schwabenland in the Queen Maud Land region, we will destroy him. And there's Spanish books out at the time, Hitler está vivo. The United States expedition arrived and landed in Antarctica, and with them the latest in military gear and gadgets. So you see, it was a warfare military operation at that time. This isn't new to the United States or Great Britain. Bases were established and quickly expanded. Now, after they set up their bases and set up their equipment, the instruments went totally haywire. The performance gauges, the altimeters behaved in a most erratic manner, causing Admiral Byrd to abort the flight and return to his base on visual controls. The altimeters weren't working, and he couldn't fly airplanes over there. It has been reported by papers and sources previously mentioned here that Admiral Byrd had located the secret Nazi base and was approaching it when an incident took place and he had to abandon the flight, and some of his planes went down. He saw it duplicated and was warned about Hitler being there and a new Berchtesgaden garden called Hitler's Shangri-La. Now, it says that 48 hours after he located some of these bases, 4 of Admiral Byrd's planes were lost, some without a trace, others without any survivors. Admiral Byrd hastily abandoned all his efforts and disembarked all his force and came home. On board his flagship, the Olympus, he gave the following interview, translated in Spanish. This is March the 5th in Chile, 1947. It was the front page of the newspapers, and Admiral Byrd was talking about what he saw down there. In quotes, Admiral Byrd declared today it was imperative for the United States to initiate immediate defense measures against hostile regions. Now, he assumed that what was going on down there was hostile, but the reason he was silenced and Forrestal was murdered was because the United States had the intent with Reinhard Gehlen, with the Hitler's agents after the war, and the Fritz Kramers and the Nazis that got out, to continue the operations down there and not to stop them. He thought this was hostile region. The planes weren't working, the altimeters weren't working, the planes were going down. The Admiral Byrd, this is Byrd, further stated he didn't want to frighten anyone unduly because it was the bitter reality that in case of a new war, the continental United States would be attacked by flying objects which could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Admiral Byrd repeated the above point of view resulting from his personal knowledge gathered from the North and South Pole that he could have, he said, at a news service, an international news service. During the press conference, the Admiral stated that in a quickly shrinking world, the United States could no longer derive any sense of security from its isolation or the geographic distance from the poles. The Admiral affirmed once again his belief that the entire Antarctic continent should be closely watched and surrounded by a wall of defense installations, since it represented the last line of defense for America. These defense measures, the book goes on to say, have been taken, but we have not had the defense down there, nor has Great Britain, on those islands, while Antarctica and Argentina could build up whatever they want. He warned about this. Admiral Byrd further stated, no one could give a more accurate accounting of the true significance of the situation than he could, since he was there. When Admiral Byrd arrived in the United States and the significance of his findings found their way into the press, he was hospitalized. Now, how often have you seen that happen since 1946-47? No hard information since that time was ever unearthed, since he was interviewed in Santiago, Chile, and the newspapers and the press conferences there. When he got home, Byrd was hospitalized. No information came out after that. It seems that his frank statements to the press in South America on board the Olympus were not appreciated by the powers that be in Washington. Now, keep in mind, in 1946, 1947, that Hitler's chief of intelligence was in Washington, in the Pentagon, setting up the National Security Council, the National Security Agency, the CIA. We didn't have until it was formally inaugurated in 1947, but those years from 45 to 47, top Nazis from Germany were in the United States Pentagon making the plans for the future. Now, what is the future? The future is what you will see in tomorrow's headlines or what you read today. That is the future. That is now. This book says when he was the first victim of a long string of prominent people removed from circulation. Now, these authors knew that he was the first of a long string. I'm sure he wasn't the first, and I know he wasn't the last, but I have said that many people have been hospitalized, have been caused, in quotes, or suicides, have been murdered, who had any inkling to catch on to these long-made plans that literally were traitors taking over America to continue what Churchill thought should have been done, fighting the Soviet Union at any sacrifice so that eventually our country is worthless in terms of what we're doing to our people here, and we've been geared to this war machine for this long, long time. This book states that for their honest belief in the unidentified flying objects and the fast speeds that could go from pole to pole, people like Admiral Byrd were put in the hospital. Now, in conclusion, I'm not going to read much of this book. I'm just going to read 7 points of conclusion because it's a whole book on this subject and the Allies and how they sent Byrd down there and wondered if Hitler and they knew many top Nazis were in Argentina, and many, of course, went down after 1946 and 47 and are working in all the South American countries. This book had several conclusions on the points that I just mentioned, and they were the following. Many definite and important conclusions can be drawn from the reporting that took place. 1, the final outcome of World War II is yet to be decided. That is borne out by the late General and former President Eisenhower. He said the Second World War has not yet ended, and it was corroborated by Admiral Byrd's alarming phrase that in case of a new war, Hitler's last battalion is waiting for its golden opportunity to tip the scale in the conflagrations to come. Secondly, the over 40 small wars since 1945, including Korea and Vietnam, of which Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer were a part, and Reinhard Gehlen, were supposed to provoke a premature showing of hands by the last battalion, but they, again, came along these last 44 small wars to bring us into a total debt that we never will be able to pay. Third, Hitler has defended that secret lair as successfully against Byrd as his numerous headquarters in Europe. Byrd was forced to retreat and to acknowledge the superiority of the UFOs and the secret weapons. 4, the new Third Reich, which I refer to always as the Fourth Reich, maintained its crucial time technology advantage over World War II adversaries. They maintained it, and by the time this book was written, they possibly increased it. 5, idealism has triumphed over materialism, in that the German state only was destroyed, but not the ideology of National Socialism. And 6, finally, there is a 30-year cover-up by brain, or more often by brawn, of the true identity of where UFOs come from, their origins, and they have suppressed the unholy alliance of 1939 to 1945. The only real reason for the UFO cover-up, and this book was written a while back, and don't forget, when this was written, they didn't know that in 1982, of April 1982, the United States Supreme Court said you cannot have information on UFOs. It's national security. Everything on UFOs that you need to know is locked up. And what they wrote in this book, on these secret weapons was the real and only reason for the insane UFO cover-up is to be found in the German origin. The Allies in the East and West have told so many lies, and now the Nazis are around, and it would be logical and natural for them to take revenge one day. We'll take a 1-minute break and get back to this subject of the Falkland Islands, Argentina, and Antarctica.
This concludes the first half of World Watch.
On this program, January the 4th, 1981, it's about a year and a half ago, this is program, tape number 474 if you have it, or you can get it if you don't have it. I mentioned a book that came out just in 1980, the end of 1980, but I haven't seen it on the stand or advertised anywhere, and you can imagine that it is probably suppressed, and we'll have to go searching for it through other means in the bookstores that are available. The book is called Assault on Eternity, written by Leslie Rose, who made an expedition with Admiral Byrd and a participant in the 1956 Antarctic expedition with Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. This author referred to Byrd as a political admiral who was considered one of the nation's top military explorers, and he died in 1957. 23 years after his death, this Leslie Rose wrote in the book, the access to his papers remains closely guarded by his family. Now, all I have is a book review from the Washington Post. I don't have the book. It's been a long time, a year and a half, but I don't have it yet. The papers of Admiral Byrd are locked up, and this biographer wanted to write a story of Admiral Byrd having gone on an expedition, but discovered that he was forced to cut the plan short when he was denied access to the Admiral's papers. This is somebody who went on an expedition with him in 56, but the 46-47 expedition was covered up. It was called Operation High Jump. It was after the World War II expedition, and that's what led Byrd down to Antarctica. Admiral Byrd had enemies within the service, this author said, because he had high up political connections that helped him leap to higher rank over others that came before him. Now, this is what happened to Alexander Haig, who graduated from West Point and was about 243rd down from the class and jumped above all of them to go over with Douglas MacArthur in Korea when he got out of West Point. He leapfrogged through the help of Henry Kissinger and the Rockefellers, a hand-picked general, to leapfrog. And the question is, did Admiral Byrd get his advantages because he covered up and allowed to be locked up what he saw in 1946 or 47. This book has just a brief description of the way, the book review, of the way the material was locked up, and mentions that in 1947, when he returned, he was met by Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who greeted Admiral Byrd when he returned from that trip in Antarctica. I have several books on Forrestal. One is The Death of James Forrestal by Coral Simpson. They describe it as a murder mystery, not fiction. The murder of the first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. This book came out in, let me see if I have the year here, by Cornell Simpson, Western Islands publisher. I didn't write down the date that was published. I'll have to give that to you next week if you want. They said this murder was the overwhelming result of assassination plot, and it goes into how he fell out of the hospital at Bethesda, Maryland on an alleged suicide, but they concluded it was a clear case of murder. That's one book on Forrestal. Another one that I have, James Forrestal, A Study of Personality and Politics by Arnold Rogow, R-O-G-O-W, published in 1963 like Macmillan. May 22nd, 1949, James Forrestal, America's first Secretary of Defense, plunged to his death from the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital. He had been put in there for psychiatric treatment, and also when Byrd came home, as I say, he was put in the hospital for other illnesses. I don't know what they called it. They described him as an intellectual poseur, expert on Wall Street and big business. He worked with the power elite. Forrestal had rejected Catholicism and converted. It's a story of his biography, The Controversies of Forrestal and his death, building up to his death at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and considering the links of Admiral Byrd and the secret papers to the Secretary of Navy, because Byrd was an admiral and Forrestal, he was Secretary of Defense, rather. He had to report to him, and tragedies and secrets followed everything that Byrd set out to do. He set out to find the answer to some questions, and all of his machinery went astray, and planes went down, and bodies weren't found. And he gave an opinion of what was happening and warned about World War III down there, that World War II never ended. And then the fellow that he reported to was dead, and Forrestal had been put in a hospital. There's an interesting article regarding the episodes down at the Falkland Islands in our Monterey Herald this Wednesday, an interview with a man who had a lot of time in Argentina, both in the military and in civilian life. The lead article is "The United States may be the loser in the Falklands." And you wonder now, with the controversies going on, how will the United States be the loser? I have a pretty good idea of 10 reasons why, but the expert on this subject is retired Army Colonel Samuel Stapleton. Now, Samuel Stapleton was the former commander of the Defense Language Institute at the Presidio of Monterey. That is the school that Lee Harvey Oswald attended for some language brushing up, and also Reinhard Gehlen from Germany, who flew out here, and I've mentioned this many times on this program. He was the head of Defense Language Institute. He is now, guess what, an executive in the International Trade Mart in New Orleans. The article didn't say how long he's been there. Now, the International Trade Mart in New Orleans was the CIA Gehlen headquarters for Clay Shaw, who was in Nazi Germany with Reinhard Gehlen when he surrendered to Allen Dulles. Clay Shaw had direct links to Argentina and to the assassination of John Kennedy through mob connections of David Ferry and the CIA and Carlos Marcello. But Clay Shaw's connections went to the Gehlen Argentine connections and the Nazi links to the Kennedy assassination. And the headquarters for the Gehlen Group was the International Trade Mart in New Orleans. Now that Clay Shaw is dead, it's interesting that the head of the Defense Language Institute for Monterey, an attaché in Argentina at one time for the military, and also a businessman with ties in Argentina, is now an executive at the International Trade Mart in Argentina. He did business there, he worked in Argentina, and he also did military work. He said regarding Great Britain, he said there's resentment against Great Britain. It is deep-seated, stemming from years of the British Empire served as mediator in the border disputes between Argentina and Chile, when British engineers built Argentine railroad, telephone, and telegraph system, and when Argentina perceived them of draining the resources by the British. He said, I like both countries very much, and I would hate to see anything bad happen, but the eventual loser will be the United States, because they are our allies, both of them. They are friends, and we are in the middle. Now, that is one of the points about this, is that this move will put a wedge into the allies to begin breaking us apart. There's a wedge between the United States and NATO now because of our policies in Germany and talk of disbanding NATO. There's a wedge between our allies and the building of the Soviet gas line that Reagan has tried to stop, and they need that gas in Europe. There are wedges coming between the United States and their allies, and as I say, if this was a long, smoldering problem between Argentina and Great Britain, the United States should not have been sending millions of dollars down there since Reagan's in office, or trading naval maneuvers with them until this was resolved. If we are the friends of both, we should have stayed out of it the last year and a half until the situation was cleaned up. But this is a perfect chance to tear us apart from our allies and to begin shred the United States apart. We're not only broken up because we're reducing the chances of education for the masses in the country, we're reducing the chances for good health care for the crippled and maimed, the amount of money we're going to allocate to these people The Social Security money is running out by 1983. I read this week the savings and loans banks are collapsing. People have no security in their banking and money system. The institutions are crumbling. The money is going to weapons, and we're sending it also to people who are fighting our friends. That we have no distinction, no morality, and the United States domestically and internationally is crumbling. Now, the people we fought in the last war, Germany and Japan, can sit back and make their televisions and their computers or their cameras in their cars and laugh at us because we have to make decisions between these various people and sit there and be humiliated like a yo-yo going up and down or a tennis ball going back and forth. The United States has put itself in this situation. And how did they put themselves there? By bringing their former enemies over to this country with this intense paranoia to have this Third World War, to wipe out the Soviet Union, and then have, in quotes, world peace. This thing has been going on and festering ever since the Russian Revolution. And in the process, the United States can be divided. It can be broken down economically, militarily. And I doubt if we solve anything down the Falkland Islands, it's going to be some other island and another area again, and it will continue. The Washington Post had an article this week, or just last week, March 30th, Reagan backs Antarctica study. Would you believe that? It's a news story. President Reagan has affirmed his administration's commitment to conduct scientific research in Antarctica with other Antarctica treaty signers. Do you have any idea of the budget the United States has mailed down to Antarctica since World War II? If you go to the bookstores, the federal government bookstores such as on Golden Gate in San Francisco or the government printing offices, get the back literature. I have it in my files, a lot of it, on books available to Antarctica. The building there, the shipping there, the money going there, the equipment going there. The United States hasn't let a hunk of ice sit there with a bunch of penguins on it and pretending we don't know what's going on there. This has been a place that is going to be more in the news. We've built it up, and now the chickens are coming home to roost, and I hope you're ready. Reagan asked the National Science Foundation to continue a budget to manage the Antarctica program. Can you imagine anything so asinine or insulting as if it hasn't been going on continuously, and all that area is charted out and mapped? There's the Rockefeller Plateau, there's the Hitler area. Get your maps on Argentina and Antarctica and how close it is to Argentina and see what's really going on. Now, are we going into World War III? People call and say, are we on the verge of war? Well, you won't know what started World War when it begins, and most people don't even know that it never stopped, that World War II never stopped. Admiral Byrd knew it, and other people know it, but it's been going on continuously. So I just thought I'd pull out of the history books a little bit of history of how World War II started to show you how aware the intellects and the thinkers are in this country. There's one thing I know, and that is that the best educational institutions such as Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Stanford or MIT or Oxford or Cambridge, these places produce cauliflowers. Those people came out with heads so muddled, they've done nothing to improve the world in general. They have left us with mass starvations, weather control, mind control, medical medications. We still have the increased binary nerve gases, nuclear weapons, weapon systems. Still, as I say, we're economically bankrupt. But who cares how World War II started? If you don't know that, you won't know how World War III started. There's a book, there's a lot of stories, of course, how World War II began, but there's a book that gives a pretty precise definition called Burn After Reading by Ladislas Farrago. Now, he's written some marvelous books on espionage and World War II, and also his book Aftermath of the migration of the people from World War II, from Italy and Germany, that went down to South America, to Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, the Nazi nest. He did a magnificent job on that. And in his book, Burn After Reading, the story of espionage, he has a chapter appropriately called Operation Canned Meat. And it begins, I'll read just a few sentences from this chapter. August the 10th, 1939, Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler's head of the secret police of the Gestapo, called a goon into his office, a man named Alfred Naujock, 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 described as a brainless tool, somewhat of a orangutan or an ape, a huge, heavy-set, tall guy, but hairless. Incidentally, remind me a description somewhat of David Ferry in New Orleans, but he was smaller of build. And they call this guy in, and they tell him, Heydrich tells Naujock, he says, the Fuhrer has decided to settle the Danzig question in Poland once and for all. We're going to smash Poland. So we will have X day and Y hour. X day will be for the provocateurs, and Y hour will be when the war begins. This was in August, and the war began in September 1939. Now, what the Fuhrer needs, Heydrich said, and this is documented in many, many books, we have to create a cause for the war. So we'll start with the Polish campaign without a formal declaration of war. And then we'll have a counterattack, and we'll tell the world it was the Poles who fired the first shot. But telling isn't enough because of the Western press. They need practical proof, hard clues. You see, he refers to the foreign press, and of course, Reuters and Associated Press, United Press, and ABC. Don't you always know they need the hardest proof before they put anything on the air, okay? I mean, the biggest liars that came down the pike. But he says, we need some hard proof. So Heydrich wants to work with the Fuhrer, and they bring in this ape. He says, we will simulate a series of frontier incidents and make it appear that the attacking forces were Poles. Now, here is a map he shows him, and he said, we have a radio station, and it is your job, he tells this guy, to stage an incident there and give the excuse for the war. He says, we will hand you 6 trustworthy SD men of their Gestapo and dress them in Polish uniforms, just like at the Battle of Malmedy, the Germans were wearing American uniforms. And at 0 hour, you, the German Nazis in Polish uniforms, will attack the radio station and seize the radio station. The Poles will take the German station. And we will have a man who will accompany you to broadcast anti-German speeches in Polish to show how bad the Germans are. Then we will have from the Gestapo jail a dozen inmates from concentration camps, which they used, and this was documented later. We will use them to make the incident look goddamn real. We'll put them in Polish uniforms and leave them dead on the ground as if they were killed under the attack. We'll give them lethal injections before they'll have those, and then we'll provide gunshot wounds. And after the incident, we'll show them to members of the foreign press. Twice he refers to the foreign press because the foreign press always needs their verification. And Goebbels is going to bring these people from Berlin. So they agreed, and they gave these Poles these lethal injections, dropped them on the road outside the radio station, and they said, let's refer to the fake Polacks. Those are the people taken by the Gestapo out of concentration camps and dressed as Poles. We'll give this the name canned meat. Those guys are going to be injected and then shot and left outside the radio station. So they called it Operation Canned Meat, and they rehearsed it August 25th. And sure enough, 2 days later, a car arrives with a Pole. He had his injection and the gunshot wounds, and his face was smeared with blood, and he was still breathing. And they bring this human prop to the station, the radio station, and set this whole thing up and begin to attack Germany in Polish on the air. And then you see these people killed. The Naujock set these men and fired in the air on canned meat. And when the show was over, the Poles, dressed as Poles, who got out of their uniforms and were really Germans, disappeared. And they gave Adolf Hitler the excuse for the war. This was Operation Canned Meat. And what they left on the ground was a man who now was dead, who became the first casualty of the Second World War. Truly, it's unknown soldier. And on September the 1st, 1939, the Wehrmacht crossed into Poland, and Hitler had a proclamation against the attack against the Poles attacking the Germans and the German radio station. And that war began within 24 hours of that. There was the Blitzkrieg, and 75% of Polish planes were destroyed, most of them in their hangars. The Nazis ruined the aircraft there and went into Poland, and Poland was Germany's. Now, this kind of wearing uniforms, simulating this, was all known to the American military by the end of the war. We let people out of the Dachau prisons, out of the Nuremberg trials, who simulated Americans and caused hundreds and thousands of deaths in single battles, particularly that Bulge and Malmedy in that area that I've been studying extensively. So this subterfuge still goes on today. There's an article in the Washington Post about a person, Ivan Quinteros, who was murdered in Chile. He was not a real political activist in the term that he was fighting the system so much as he was working for social changes. And he left Chile for a while and came back to Chile. And last month, his mother filed a complaint against the government, saying that he was not armed when he came back to Chile when he was killed, that a bus full of the police shot him down in front of witnesses, and then they saw the police fire bullets into their own vehicles to simulate a fight. They shot a man, a alleged leftist or suspected leftist. They shot him, and then they shoot the bus as an excuse. He was shooting at us, so we had to shoot him. There were deaths of 10 people recently killed in Chile, and it keeps going on and on. Labor organizers, an article on human rights in Chile, our great ally that we're recognizing now, and the same agent provocateurs down there. This is Washington Post, March 27th, 1982. And speaking of Chile, there's an article, the Chilean accused of rights violations has now taken a post in the Washington embassy. This is Ronald Reagan again, a Chilean army colonel who was forced to leave as military attaché in West Germany 5 years ago because of his role of killing thousands of people and torturing them in Chile at his torture center, now works in the Chilean embassy in Washington, D.C. Can you imagine what our capital is today with these kind of people being recognized and whining and dining in those embassies, the Reagan administration at the present time? The man's name is Christian Akernecht, Akerknecht. He ran a torture center in Chile, and Der Spiegel ran articles in Germany. He was responsible for the torture of at least 3,500 political prisoners inside of Chile, and when he was stationed in West Germany as part of the Chilean embassy, they kicked him out of West Germany because of his torture and behavior. West Germany couldn't stand this rat, and the United States has him in Washington and recognizes the Chilean embassy. This is March 19th, 1982. This is just 2 weeks ago from the New York Times article. It was also in the Washington Post. The United States State Department, that's Alexander Haig and Caspar Weinberger and Walter Stessel, has taken the position that it is satisfied with the Chilean embassy response, that they put to rest any doubt or question about this man. He was kicked out of Germany and left because of his torture. An official of the German Foreign Ministry confirmed that the Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, on the basis of charges, asked him to be withdrawn from the Chilean embassy. So now he represents Chile in the United States. Do you want to vomit? I suppose you can. And against Alexander Haig this week with his holy war said, Alexander's state maintained we have to have a strong nuclear deterrent for protecting the essential values of the Western civilization, and he would not rule out the use of a first strike nuclear weapon. New York Times this week. What is Western civilization? You better think twice about that. There's a group in California that has headquarters in Germany. I mentioned once with regards to religious cults, it's called the Fellowship of Friends. They have a winery up in Sacramento, unlimited money. They have art, oil paintings, and they pipe in music of Bach and Beethoven and Brahms because After we have World War III, they're going to maintain the culture of Western civilization, the German culture, mind you. And when Haig begins to talk about the essential values of Western civilization, is he talking about United States civilization or Western German civilization? Keep in mind, he has a holy war, and his mentor is Fritz Kramer, who can't be smoked out, can't be identified with his Nazi past, with his IG Farben family, sitting in the Pentagon making decisions today with a group of cruddy people. What does he mean by Western civilization? In lieu of the heavily funded organizations such as this group, who have headquarters in Cincinnati and also in Carmel and in Texas and about 20 American cities, I have a list of them. Where else are these people maintaining the classics of art that they can produce later, the hidden art, to bring back the German artists? Hitler's paintings have now been returned to Germany by Ronald Reagan again. They were in this country, and so forth. You might have read an article in the San Francisco Chronicle. Don't count on the Golden Gate Bridge in case of an atomic attack. Do you like that kind of talk? Another article in the Monterey Herald this week, an interview of a professor, Ole Holstein, from Duke University, who said the following. He talked to the Monterey Institute out here last week of International Studies. He said the Defense Department is hell-bent on having a war. They have decided that war is inevitable if the Soviet Union doesn't change its policies. They're throwing money at the Pentagon. They're trying to restore, in quotes, national will. We will use military might. And the United States has decided, he said, to write off Western Europe as hopeless because it is unwilling to take a hard line against the Soviet Union. That's why I think, in summary, that Haig is going to align with Argentina, the South American Nazis. I think this smiling face with Margaret Thatcher is a front. I think the United States Embassy, our War Department, is geared to the Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, the Nazi group down there that we have encouraged, funded, and silently allowed to grow and grow, and the Antarctica team that we have been sending equipment to for years. This particular fellow writes books, and he lectured out here, and he said the administration sees the world in terms of United States-Soviet conflicts. And it goes back, he says, similar to earlier period before World War II, and he says that the Reaganites are not against communism, they're against the Soviet Union. Now, that struggle began at the time of the Russian Revolution when they kicked the monarchy out and the church besides, and it's been a religious war, a holy war, to get their hands back into Russia and establish the institutions that we have here. There won't be more freedom there any more than there is in Argentina, but we're not fighting for freedom. We're fighting for wiping out the Soviet Union, and this fellow was talking on the Reagan administration has a prescription for a buildup of a limited nuclear war. They refer to a limited nuclear war, and they really believe it. And as I say, a visitor who was in Washington last week said that when they refer to a limited nuclear war, 1/3 of the American population. Well, I don't think the Falkland Islands is over oil. I don't think it has anything to do with controlling that whole area down there that has been built up for a long, long time. And I think Argentina is testing their muscles now. They're kicking England's ass. They want to get at them. They want to divide us among our allies. They want to start stirring up a lot of rumble and trouble, and they'll do a good job of it. And if this is quiet for a while, it will stir again. There is too much going on in Antarctica, Argentina, and that part of the world too long without something erupting. And I think it's starting very slowly with a few sheep herders and some Baha'is down at the Falklands. But the real issue goes back to what Admiral Byrd saw and wrote about that is locked up in the archives. The truth of what's going to come out of there is what's locked up that we haven't yet been allowed to see. Well, this is enough for this week. We'll get back to some of this and more of the same next week. In the meanwhile, you take care. And this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
KLRB.